Welcome back to another episode of the Braun Performance and Rehab Podcast, powered by ISOFIT and Oro Muscles. Joining me today is Tracy Leaumont. Tracy and I are going to be diving into Trace and I are going to be diving into her journey recovering from compartment syndrome, not once, but twice. We dive into the challenges that she's faced, the obstacles that she's faced. We dive into the lessons that she's learned, the wins she's had, and so much more along the way, in addition to a lot of good information about the diagnosis of compartment syndrome, what it means, and so on that way. I highly recommend you check out everything that Trace is doing on social media that way if you haven't already, because she's doing great work in relation to this space and really documenting and sharing her journey really well. Enjoy. Tracy, welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to work with you today. For people who maybe haven't gotten to know you quite as well as I have, and they're not familiar with the journey that you've been on through two major procedures now, would you mind filling them in a little bit about who you are and the last few years and what it's entailed for you?
Oh, where to even start? I guess I started having pain with my sport when I was in high school. I was a track athlete and I pole vaulted. But with pole vault, you just run like short bursts at a time. So it was very manageable. And then as I got older, I switched into ultimate frisbee. I played that through college and then post college when I was in grad school. And now, even after all of that, I still play. And the pain just kind of got worse and worse and worse. And everyone told me shin splints for a long time. And so I just treated it as such for years and years. And then in the spring of 2023, right before season start, we went to this fun tournament and everyone just dresses up and it's super low key and it's not really for winning or losing, it's just to play. And I just remember like knowing in my gut that something was wrong because I was in so much pain. So I ignored it as one does. Played through that whole season, which season for Frisbee starts in like May, June. That's when tryouts and the first games start. And then goes through September, October, depending on how far you make it in the series. And we made it to regionals that year. The last game I played at regionals, my husband had to carry me to the bathroom because I was just in so much pain I couldn't really walk. And so that's when I was like, no, something is up. And that's where I got diagnosed with compartment syndrome shortly after.
I think that unfortunately your story is not unique in the sense that I've heard that from so many other people, too many people, I think, where, they tell me that they've been, blowing the whistle for a long time. They've been telling people, hey, look, my legs freaking hurt. And everyone just kind of brushes them to the side and doesn't ever really take the time to look into it more. They don't take it seriously for whatever reason. And I mean, as providers, like, I get it. Diagnosing stuff can be very difficult, and a lot of providers are certainly like short staffed or don't have enough time with their athletes. Like, I get it. There's every reason in the world out there to defend the provider, but by the same token, at the end of the day, we have to eventually start to ask ourselves, like, how much of this are we willing to take? And
Mhm.
what things should we be doing differently? Because it's clear that this system that we currently have is not working in favor of the athlete. Because
Yeah.
again, unfortunately, I've heard many other stories just like yours that way. And as you mentioned, found out you had the compartment syndrome diagnosis that way, and that, obviously leads to a fasciotomy surgery. But the rest of the story, from what I understand, there was some long-term issues as well, correct?
Yeah. Yeah. So the first surgery I had, so I got diagnosed in September, like right after regionals. I went to a sports medicine doctor, and within like 3 minutes, he looked at me. He said, "This is not shin splints. Like it would have gotten better, or you'd have a stress fracture by now," which is something people don't talk about. Also, is like shin splints can develop into something worse if you don't treat them. So it bothers me that we treat them as like trivial, but not the point. And so he referred me to an orthopedic surgeon, and she agreed very quickly. And we did some tests to rule out other things, but yeah, I got my first bilateral fasciotomies, all four compartments of the lower legs on November 8th, 2023. So it took like maybe 2 months to get it all set up. It was very quick, which I've heard is not always the case. So I feel very fortunate. And then recovering from that was a beast. I got a massive hematoma in my right leg, and it was like intramuscular, so it was pretty deep in the leg. So I could not walk for a very long time. 25 days I was in a wheelchair or on crutches. after like the 2, 3 month mark, I just started to grow exponentially, and I was back to running and playing frisbee, and everything just kind of fell into place. And I remember running, and I got to like 3, 4 miles, just that feeling of running pain-free and nothing was wrong. It's like indescribable when you've been in pain for so long. It was so wonderful. And I kind of think if I didn't ever have that, maybe I wouldn't have had surgery again when it ended up coming back. But because I had that taste of like what pain-free running could be, it was hard to say no to a second surgery, which foreshadowing, it ended up partially failing where my anterior and lateral compartments closed back up. And then I did surgery again this past December of 2024, and I did them one at a time. So December 5th and then the 19th.
Gotcha. So at this point, we're about a month out from the second of the second round and about
Yes.
6, 7 weeks from the first there. And, to the point that you made about having that ability to function pain-free and run 3 to 4 miles without any symptoms in the leg, from
Mhm.
what you've shared of your story, that was the first time in years that you
Yeah.
had that, right? Like that was not
Yeah.
something that was just like, oh, last year I was doing this year, glad to be back. It's like, that was the first time you felt that way in over 5 years, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Even in high school, I played soccer for a long time growing up, and I remember trying out for the soccer team and not wanting to do it. I remember thinking, like, I just can't, I won't be able to, like, because I'm in pain running long distances. I'd rather just focus on track. It's something I can do short term.
Yeah, no, it's better to do something than nothing, obviously, but
Yeah.
it's still a shame that, unfortunately, it sounds like this prevented you from doing the things that you wanted to do at a
Yeah.
younger age that way.
Mm.
I'm curious, as you were kind of going through this journey and talking with different doctors and orthos and experts, did anyone ever like come up with like a possible timeline for how long you had this? Like, was this something that definitely traced back to high school or anything that way, or?
I've been told something different from everyone. My first physical therapist was like, no, this is congenital. You probably had it your whole life. It started as you got more active. But that never made sense to me because I was very active as a kid. I did every sport my school offered in middle school and then high school trying to figure out what I wanted to do. So I was like, I don't know about that one. And then someone else mentioned that like once you get through puberty, that's when it can start to hit. And that made a little bit more sense because like 17, 18 is when I really started to be in pain.
On that congenital side for a second, I haven't really seen anything. I mean, there's neonatal compartment syndrome. Don't get me wrong, that's a real thing. But I find the congenital piece a little bit misunderstood that way. And maybe there's just not enough information on it yet, or maybe I haven't seen enough of it and it exists out there already. But I don't know. I find that this entire diagnosis and recovery process for a lot of people that I've worked with does not get enough attention. And it's a lot more challenging than I think we give it credit for. And I think
Mhm.
that there's so many different forms of information, but we don't really know as much as we think we do about it. And I think, to your point about requiring a second procedure, I want to say the current rate is about 1 in 2 people that
Wow.
undergo a fasciotomy are going to need a second procedure because the first
Yeah.
one doesn't fully resolve their symptoms. And it's just crazy for me as a provider to try and wrap my head around that, right? Like it just, I have a hard time recommending something to someone if I know there's a 50% chance it's not going to work, right? Like,
Right.
if I don't think spinal manipulation is going to work for someone in clinic, then I'm probably not going to do it. But in
Mhm.
this specific case or in this specific, diagnosis that way, unfortunately, this is kind of all we can do or the best we can do at
Yeah.
this point, which is just really frustrating, I'd imagine, from your end, because it's like you want better, you deserve better. This should have, if there was something earlier, it should have been caught. And it just, in my opinion, and again, I'm on the outside looking back retrospectively, so there's a little bias with that. But in my mind, I just can't help but wonder, could it have been caught earlier?
Surely it could have. I think there's so little information out there about it. Even when I first was diagnosed with it or was thinking about it, there's such little information out there about it when I was first looking for a diagnosis and it kind of came up. and I was researching it. I know a lot of people go to Reddit because it's like that's where the real info is, right? And there wasn't even a subreddit for it at the time, a
Really?
year and a half ago. And then if there was, I couldn't find it. And then I just recently went and looked, and there's one now. So I think it's rapidly increasing, but it's still so new, and there's so much that needs to be researched and discovered that it's hard to get a diagnosis.
Definitely. Tell me more about the best resources that you found going through this on your end. What kind of things did you find were, really helpful and beneficial versus things that you find didn't really give you what you needed?
The best thing for me was finding people who understood what I was going through. And I did that through TikTok. I made so many people, met so many people who were in the same boat as me or going through a diagnosis, going through fasciotomies. And it just, that's the best wealth of information I had because those people are living through it actively versus just like WebMD, which isn't even
You,
correct if you ask me.
you mean WebMD and ChatGPT aren't getting it right out here?
No, definitely not.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, no, I completely agree. There's so much power in the effect you can have when you bring people together and the sense of community, the sense of, hey, I'm not alone during this struggle, and there's other people who are facing the same thing, and some of them might have it a little bit easier, and others might have it far worse off. And I think the more you bring people together in that sense, the better it is going to be for everyone involved that way. And I think that that's something we can all kind of take something and learn from, I think, right? Like, again, I know a lot of people, even in the rehab world, are trying to get into this like online virtual rehab and, oh, you don't need to go in or you don't need to see a provider, just do it from home, AI generated, whatever, because I think there's something that we can't necessarily like quantify about that human interaction and the interaction with someone who's, hopefully working in your best interest to get you back and, is supportive and communicative and just, kind of has you along every step of that way, if you will. And I think that if you have that, it just makes that recovery journey from whatever injury you're rehabbing significantly easier, and significantly more effective that way.
Totally. And having those people, I mean, I met people in that app where I would talk to them every day and we would exchange how we were doing, and I would wait for their news from an appointment. They would wait for mine, and just to have that support was so helpful because I don't think people quite understand the pain that comes with compartment syndrome. They just think like, oh, your feet go numb and then you can't walk. But it's so much more than that. And of course, people present differently. Some people have no pain, but for me, I was in excruciating amounts of pain, and it really affected my play, and it also would get in my head because everyone was like, it's just shin splints, like wear your sleeves and move on. To know like this is something more, and I'm in pain and I'm not playing to my best ability, and now I'm not getting playtime, and it's just mentally taxing.
It creates a very frustrating situation by the sounds. And,
Yeah.
I guess I got to ask, what was the rehab journey like for you? Did you have good experiences? Did you have poor experiences? What did that whole side of this picture look like for you?
Yeah, I think the first month was so hard. I don't even know if that's the best word to use, but nobody warned me how difficult a bilateral surgery like that could be. And so I just went into it, and my doctor's military or ex-military. So she was like, 4 to 6 weeks, you'll be back in your sport. I was like, sweet, this will be so easy and simple. And then I didn't even walk for the first 4 weeks. I'm like, how on earth do people go back to their sport after 6 weeks? I just don't get it. And so that first month was hard, and I was on the couch a lot of the time and couldn't move, and I wasn't reaching out to people. Like, kind of went through a minor depression because it just everything that I loved had been taken away. Everything I used to get those endorphins I couldn't do, and I just felt really alone. And so that first month sucked, but after that, it started to be really exciting. And I kind of flipped my mindset of like, okay, every time I do something new, we should celebrate it. Like, we should make a big deal about this because that's huge if I couldn't walk a month ago. And then I started posting that way on TikTok, and then people would celebrate with me and they would help me. And then anytime I had a setback, I would freak out and be like, oh my gosh, this is over. Like, surgery failed. And people would just tell me, no, that's not. that's not how it works. Recovery is not linear. And so it kind of became like a fun journey towards the middle and the end of recovering.
Yeah, I like your point on the fact that recovery is unfortunately not linear, and we have a lot of good days and a lot of bad days in there. And I also like your point that you mentioned about kind of breaking things up into smaller goals that way. And that's something that I do with a lot of the athletes that I work with when they're coming to me for long-term rehab. So I don't care if it's ACL or shoulder labrum or compartment syndrome, whatever it is. If I know I'm going to be working with someone for months and months and months, then we can't just kind of keep our eyes on the prize that's coming 3 to 6 months later because unfortunately that's just a little too far off for most people. So instead, we kind of try and shift our focus and emphasize the smaller day-to-day, week-to-week wins, right? So, instead of just focusing on the thing that we're going to work towards in 3 or 4 months, maybe that's running our first mile again. Maybe instead we just focus on, hey, look, this week we're going to do X, Y, and Z. Yeah, they're not as big, they're not as milestone worthy, right? Like it's not as exciting as running that far, but guess what? It's further along the process than we were
Yeah.
yesterday, than we were last week. And I think the more
Yeah.
you emphasize that concept of stacking small wins in this space,
Mhm.
the better off the process becomes. And to your point as well, I think that there's a lot of different things that people go through, whether it's just like this identity crisis or just whatever it is, this self struggle that comes with being able to do things. In your case, it was painful, but you're still able to do stuff. You're able to,
Mhm.
run track and different things that way. To now all of a sudden, shoot, I can't even walk. Like, your
Mhm.
independence, a lot of the autonomy that you get is taken from you during the initial stages of the recovery. And I don't think
Mhm.
that's discussed enough, in my opinion. And I'd imagine for you, you're probably able, like now you can probably just up and drive wherever you go, whatever you want to do. And I know you work as a teacher as well that way. And I'd imagine that some of these struggles that you faced initially kind of bleed over into other areas of life, for lack of a better way to put it.
Exactly. And when I'm in PT now, obviously for recovery, and every time they ask me like, well, are you able to do the things you need to do to survive? And I'm like, well, I mean, I can drive a car, go to work, take a shower, but in order to be good at going to work and being a good teacher, I need to be able to work out. I need to be able to go swim or run. Like those are the things that keep me sane enough to hang out with 17 7-year-olds all day. So it's like, no, not really.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I'd imagine to work with 7-year-olds, you have to be on your feet and quick and active all the
Uh-huh.
time. And if you're not in a state of constant energized where you can do that, that's
Right.
that's a rather difficult age group to work with, right?
Yeah. Yeah. After surgery, I got a rolly stool, like one of those garage ones, and I just roll around my classroom on it. And now every time I stand up, my kids yell at me, Miss, I'll sit back down.
That's
So
hilarious. That's hilarious. And
at least
I
I've been.
know as I've worked with other individuals who are recovering from compartment syndrome, some try different things. Like I know Botox injections were a thought at one point that way. I'm curious, did you try anything other than the surgical approach that way to try and help manage the symptoms and stuff associated with the compartment syndrome? And if so, what did that look like? What did it entail? And what were the results you felt from it?
Yeah, I mean, I did most of the conservative treatments, the PT, the scraping, the stem unit, I think is what it's called. The compression sleeves, ice cupping, most of those conservative things I did for about a year. Scraping was actually a little beneficial. My PT has a theory that it loosens the fascia, and so that might be why, but it was never long term. It would give me relief for like a day. So she taught me how to scrape, and I would scrape the morning of tournaments, and it would help me for about the first game and a half, and then I was back into pain. So it would prolong, I think, the symptoms coming on, but it wasn't lasting, wasn't permanent. And then I was actually never offered Botox or anything else before surgery. Not that I think it would have made a difference because I was offered it after my first surgery failed. And the way that my surgeon and the doctor who did my EMG talked about it, it just seemed really risky in terms of permanent side effects. And I know surgery is the same way, but it felt like it wasn't going to be long term. You have to keep going, and you can actually like lose ability to move your feet if something goes wrong. So I was swayed against that, but I think I don't think I would have done it even if someone told me it would have been a good idea because it's not covered by insurance usually. And my surgery was completely covered the second time. So,
Yeah, no, there's always that financial burden of treatment too that adds up. And once again, I don't think that's discussed enough either, because obviously all of these things carry a cost with them, not just on your own side, but also the financial burden that comes with it as well. And it's interesting that you mentioned the scraping or eye stem that way, because that came up when we were doing the podcast with Jake O'Neill that way from Rothman, and having worked with some of his patients in the past who are, post fasciotomies that way. One of the things that he really heavily emphasizes is the importance of soft tissue work in the
mhm,
recovery for this that way. And he doesn't necessarily care what you use, whether it's your hands or tools or whatever it is that way, but he seems to put a lot of value on clinicians actually getting their hands on people and digging in. And, the research on that is a little bit unclear in the sense that, some people think we're breaking up scar tissue and adhesions, and others will say, well, no one is putting that much pressure to be able to even do that. So there's still a little bit of debate as far as what that actually does or
mhm.
how it's affecting the human body that way in the recovery process. But it seems clear that the experts agree that it's important enough that we should do it. And
Mhm.
in your case, if you feel better afterwards,
Right.
then we should definitely be doing that for people. And I think
Yeah.
that's something that, a lot of people have this disconnect with, in the sense that they think that, well, the research isn't clear on it, so we shouldn't do it. Well, in my mind, N equals one every time. Every single person is their own case study. We don't know how they're going to respond, and they're never going to present identical to any research article that's
Yeah.
out there. So if they're responding well to something, maybe we should just do a little bit more of that for them, especially
Right.
if it's giving them relief.
Yeah, yeah. And what is so wild to me about this condition, because it's so understudied, is I've talked with, I would say, hundreds of people on TikTok who have the same diagnosis and have gone through procedures or have gone through Botox or doing the saline injections. And every person, almost every person, tells me something different. Like their surgeons are having them recover in different ways. And anytime anyone asks me what advice you have, the very first thing I always tell people is to move your ankles after surgery. Like so much ankle mobility to prevent scarring over of that compartment. And one girl told me that she was put in two boots post-op for like a month. I was like, what? Like, that's certainly gonna cause problems because you're not moving, and I feel like you're just gonna scar right over. But obviously, I'm not a healthcare provider, and I preface that every time. But it just is crazy to me that there's no real standard protocol for recovery.
Protocol is a little bit mixed. Even the surgical approach can be a little bit mixed sometimes
Hmm.
too, where, certain surgeons do it slightly differently that
Yeah.
way. So there's a lot of differences and a lot of things to keep in mind. And, the one common theme I do see though, regardless of what the surgical approach used is and so on that way, is a lot of athletes that I work with have some kind of issues post-operatively, not necessarily where they are required to have a second surgery, but maybe they have some kind of like numbness that develops and it just
Mhm.
annoys them. It doesn't
Yeah.
cause pain, but it just annoys them by the fact that they can't feel this certain strip of skin or this certain area of their leg anymore. I'm curious, did you have anything like that after the first or the second procedure? And if so, how did you kind of handle it, respond to it, that sort of thing?
Yeah, totally. My first surgery I got very lucky. The only part that went numb was around my lower right leg incision, and it's still pretty numb to this day. And that one was weird. It didn't bother me. Like I said, it was more just annoying. And I remember being scared to shave over it for a really long time because it felt so strange. Other than that, I was fine. The second surgery was on my right leg, and again, same kind of numbness in that area, but it was normal, totally fine. I was used to it. My left leg, third surgery, was the hardest because you get the surgery because your feet are going numb and you're having pain in your legs. And then I woke up and the top of my left foot was completely numb. It's still pretty numb. And so to have the surgery for numbness and then wake up with numbness, like it's so confusing and scary.
You're
Uh,
like, wait a second, what happened here?
yeah, and I talked with my surgeon and she said that my left perineal, I think that's how you say it, uh,
Pronial.
perennial nerve was completely encased in scar tissue, and so she had to really bother it to free it from scar tissue. And so she thinks it's just angry from being touched, and that the more that the swelling goes away and the more I touch it with my hands, that the feeling will come back.
It's so interesting that you say that because in cases that I've seen in the past where, a second procedure is required, there is something about this excessive development of scar tissue and scarring in of certain areas that is linked there. And I don't fully understand that, but I've seen that with other individuals in the past. And going back to what I mentioned before about the soft tissue interventions that way. Maybe it does something, maybe it doesn't. I don't think we fully 100% know and appreciate that. I would say
Yeah.
the other piece is, I just coming from more of a holistic background myself that way. In the back of my mind, I can't help but wonder, is there something else that we're missing here? Because obviously, in spaces like physical therapy and orthopedics, we have a tendency to focus strongly on the physical. However, I can't help but wonder about the physiological. Is there something else that we're missing here from a more holistic standpoint? Is there something going on from a nutrition standpoint or a
Hmm.
sleep standpoint or a stress management standpoint? The body is weird and
Yeah.
complex. And like I said, just in relation to this procedure, but also in general, there's still a lot that we really don't know. And I
Hmm.
think that maybe, in our midst of not looking at this through as much of a fine-tooth comb as we should have, perhaps we missed something else that's playing a role into why so much of
Yeah.
this scar tissue forms, post-operatively that way and the issues that come with it.
Yeah. I have two thoughts in regards to that. The first, definitely, I think there are other things going on with compartment syndrome in a lot of people. When I was pre-op, my second surgery, so over a year, my first surgery, my lower right leg incision started to reopen like a year later, which is bonkers. I had no idea that could even happen. And I remember messaging my surgeon a picture of it 2 days before surgery, and I was like, is this gonna affect my surgery? Like, do I need to do anything about this? And she's like, well, we're gonna cut you open anyway. So, but I have a friend who's in med school, and she was like, that's concerning. Like, I feel like there's something else going on if your scar is reopening. And then my second point is I was training for half when I recovered from my first surgery, and I started having hip pain, even though I was doing PT every single day for pretty much whole body at that point. Started having hip pain, and I kind of ignored it for a while because that's what I've been trained to do. And long story short, I ended up having bilateral labral tears in my hips. And a lot of people on TikTok said they had the same thing where they got compartment syndrome surgery, fasciotomies, and then they found out they had labral tears. It's like, I know correlation doesn't equal causation, but it feels like there's something going on.
Yeah, no, definitely. And it's so interesting that you bring up the hip labrum tear because this is another common area that I see issues with at the hip that
Mhm.
way. And I think that we've done a really good job in the space of understanding the shoulder labrum and why that gets injured and so on that way. But
Yeah.
in relation to the hip, I don't feel like we have nearly as much of an understanding. And obviously, there's great surgical approaches to repair it, but to your point about it being bilateral, I can't remember the exact stat. I want to say it's 1 in 3 individuals who undergo hip labrum surgery on one hip are also going to need it on the other hip in the future as well. So it's just this weird kind of like, we don't fully understand, why it comes about that way. But, to that point as well, I mean, we had a guy, Shane Dowd, on the podcast a while ago who had full circumferential labrum tear and all these other crazy things on his MRA, and he's functioning completely fine. He's pain free. He can do the splits. He can do all these crazy things that I can only dream of with, as far as I know, I have intact hip labrum on both hips that way. So it's just crazy how even if it is torn in someone or two people or three people, they all present slightly differently.
Yeah.
And they're never, like limited in the same way that way. And I think that's the reason we need to individualize our care a little bit more is if we're just going based on ICD-10 codes and, the diagnosis that comes in and try to treat everyone the same, then, we're not really going to get anywhere because the same things impact different people, different individuals
Mhm.
differently that way.
Yeah. And that's exactly what my PT has told me is that sometimes it's an incidental finding and you just happen upon it, and that it's a very common finding in a lot of people. A lot of people can go on just fine with minor labral tears or labrum tears. And so I'm just like holding hope onto that PT and non-surgical options will help with the hip pain because three surgeries is plenty. I'm good.
No, three is definitely enough. And it's interesting to think about too, because in relation to your recovery from fasciotomy, it's not like your activity was the highest it's ever been.
No,
So,
definitely not.
some people are very quick to point out, well, you increased activity or you did more, or you did this or that. And it's like, in your case, you were recovering from multiple surgeries.
Yeah.
So I find it hard to believe that activity was the culprit behind hip labrum pathology that way. And I mean, there are certain individuals, you mentioned genetic predisposition before in relation to compartment syndrome. And like I mentioned, I think that's still not as well understood as a lot of people think.
Yeah.
But in the hip, there is definitely some research to show changes or differences in hip morphology and the shape of the joint and how that can have a impact long term there. So I certainly think there's a element to it there, but even still, there's plenty of people with bad genetics out there that never struggle with those kind of injuries. So maybe some of it is genetic, but I think a lot of it is kind of that nature versus nurture debate. I think a
Mhm.
lot more of it is nurture than nature in this case.
Yeah. I also think having gone through compartment syndrome first and just feeling that insane amount of pain, like that's just the most pain I've ever been in was compartment syndrome. That last frisbee game I played, almost screaming in pain. I can't even fathom that amount of pain anymore. And so to have my hip bother me, I'm like, this is nothing.
It's just
Like
another day.
it's just another day. It just hurts a little bit and like is kind of annoying. So I think that's why I put off looking into treating it so long. So
I can certainly understand that. I guess I'm curious too, is there anything else that you're doing different this time around from a rehab standpoint or recovery standpoint than the first time around? Any differences in your approach on your end or the physical therapy approach or surgeon approach or anything that way?
I think minor things. I increased ankle mobility even more. So first surgery, I was doing about 10 ankle pumps every hour. And this time I was doing 30 every hour. And then I would stand every hour and try to walk around. But for real, my right leg felt like they didn't even cut it open. It was the oddest thing. I walked out of the hospital. I never needed crutches for it. It it never felt painful. I didn't ever use narcotics. Like it was crazy. And then my left leg was pretty much what you would expect with a lot of pain and needing crutches and stuff. Um, so just moving more. And then this is a small thing, but I tried to really increase my protein intake because I've heard that can help with recovery and drinking a lot of water. Other than that, pretty much the same.
Yeah, no, I think those are important points that way. And it's interesting. I know that there's some work being done by individuals like Catherine Logan and her colleagues in relation to the ACL space and trying to get a more in-depth understanding of the nutrition role in the recovery process that way. I haven't seen enough in relation to the compartment syndrome yet, but I do think a lot of those general things that are very easy to not do when you're recovering from a surgery, like drinking water and eating right that way can certainly make a difference that way. And, this is a certainly completely unrelated topic and procedure, but back in 2019, it was right before COVID basically ended the world for a while. I had a abdominal procedure done myself that way to repair bilateral hernias that I don't know where they came from, but whatever. And in that process, in the back of my mind, I was just thinking about a lot of the different post-operative complications that I was reading about and seeing and learned about in PT school at the time. And a lot of them, in my mind, just kept coming back to bacteria, infections, all these different things that way. And I don't know if it made a difference or not, but I went like super clean, healthy eating for like 2 to 3 weeks after that procedure. And then, of course, this could be the thing that the surgeon says to everyone. I don't know, but the surgeon was like, "Oh, you're doing great. I've never seen anyone recover like this before. Go out there like you're cleared in record time, yada yada yada." And in the back of my mind, sometimes I think about maybe the nutrition role and just eating really healthy, even though it sucked because, like, when you're laid up in the house, everything looks good and you just
Yeah.
want to eat to kill the boredom, so to speak. I can't help but wonder if there was something more there that might have had a positive impact. I don't know. I don't think
Yeah,
anyone's ever going to know for 100% certainty, but I certainly don't think those things hurt the recovery
right,
process.
right. Might
So,
as well try them.
yeah, no, 100%. And I think this is another area. We talked about it with a girl named Sarah on the podcast back in December in relation to the ACL, where she felt support groups would be really, really helpful and beneficial that way. And I feel like this compartment syndrome, lower limb injury that's really not well understood would be another phenomenal spot for it. You mentioned TikTok as a resource and Reddit that way, but I think it'd be really awesome to see healthcare networks like some of these larger ones that exist in the
Yeah,
country. Like give me like a Kaiser Permanente or a Rothman or something like
yeah.
that, for example. I would love to see them put together support groups for individuals who are recovering from compartment syndrome fasciotomy. Again, going back to what we talked about earlier, the community piece. Just bring people together and let them talk about their experiences and share their highs and lows because I
Yeah.
think that helps the recovery process for everyone. And I think that especially in relation to things that we don't fully understand, the more we let people share their own journeys and experiences and what works for them, the
Mhm.
better off everyone is going to be.
Yeah, I totally agree. And something I've tried to do on my platforms is post a lot of those wins. Like this week I finally did this, or now I'm running and now I ran a 5K, and just posting a lot of positive videos because it's just like reviewing anything. There's going to be a lot of negative stuff on the internet. People don't tend to post surgery went perfectly and I'm back to my life. And so I'm trying to be that hope for people that it can and does work and that it's the recovery sucks for sure, but it's not forever.
No, I think that's a great point. Is this is all temporary, and in your case, where you've had long-standing history of pain and issues that way, I think to know that there's a light at the end of this tunnel has got to be a great thing for you.
Yes. Yeah, I even need to go back and watch my own videos and be like, okay, it's gonna get better. This is not forever.
It does get better. I'm curious, once this gets better, to
Mhm,
use those terms again, what's
mhm.
on the agenda for you, or what is the future going to bring? Are you going to run that half marathon, or what does the future hold?
Yeah, it's funny. I thought I would miss my sport the most, but after I got through the surgery and started running, started training for a half, I just found so much peace in running alone and finally doing a sport that was not team-based. Um, and of course, I miss frisbee. Frisbee will always be a part of my story, and I would love to play here and there, but I really just miss the running. I just want to get back to racing, and I would love a half. I'd love a full, but I'm trying not to be over zealous.
One thing at a time.
Yeah, exactly.
Start with a mile, and then a mile becomes a 5K, and then it's just
Yeah,
going to kind of snowball from there.
yeah, exactly.
No, that's awesome. Tracy, I feel like we've covered a lot of different, topics in relation to your own compartment syndrome recovery. We also brought up the hip labrum and so many other different things along the way there. Is there anything else that you wanted to discuss or anything else that we missed as we were chatting about everything today?
Oh gosh, I wish people, if there was like one thing I could tell someone going through the diagnostic process is just to not gaslight yourself and just continue to advocate for yourself until you find someone who takes you seriously. Because even if it is just shin splints, like that's something that deserves treatment and you deserve to feel better and be pain-free.
Going off of that as well, I think you deserve to have like a definitive answer on what's going on with your
Yeah,
body and what to do about it, right? Because unfortunately, we only get one of these things.
right.
So, if there's any doubt, if there's any uncertainty, if you're not really comfortable with things, go
Hmm.
ahead, get a second opinion, do whatever you've got to do. And
Yeah,
that's something that I advocate for all the athletes that I work with, even in relation to physical therapy. A lot of times athletes go and they see a PT and they're like, well, this is my PT, this is my rehab, this is what we're going to do. But just like we mentioned with orthopedic surgery, there's different approaches and different, ways to tackle problems. The same is true in the rehab that way, and not all PT is created the same. So, I certainly think that this is an area where, to your point, advocating for yourself is absolutely essential. And I know it can be very difficult to do,
mhm.
but you deserve it at the end of the day.
Yeah. Something I went to grad school for genetics, and something we always said is it's rare until it's not. So
Yeah, no,
can't help it.
exactly. That's such a great point. And Tracy, I know you're constantly posting all kinds of great content around this topic. I know it's mostly on Instagram now, but just in case TikTok does get revitalized and comes back,
Yes.
what are the links to all of your social media platforms?
So right now it is just Instagram and TikTok. I would love to make a YouTube, but that would probably be summer break for me when I found the other time to do that. But they're all the same. It is pick up the trace, a play on pick up the pace.
I was going to say, what's the origin of that?
Well, my full name is Tracy, but I prefer going by Trace, and so it's just a play on pick up the trace, pick up the pace.
I love that. I love that. This was a really incredible discussion. I really appreciate your time, Trace, and look forward to future conversations with you. Thank you for your time.
Perfect. Thanks for having me on here.